Our reading today is from Daniel 3, verses 14 through 18. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning, fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." The word of the Lord.
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, good morning. How's everyone doing? Can't really see you over there, but I'll take that sound as a good sign. Well, good morning. My name's Andy. If you're new, I'm one of the pastors here, and we're so good to be together this morning. And if you're new or you've been away, we are in the third week of a teaching series called Life in Babylon, which on first hearing might sound rather abstract or even a little bit random. But I think what we've been seeing is that this idea has very real and important implications for our real lives, the way we spend our time, the way we interact with people, what we do at work, and all kinds of different ways. And it's this notion that we today, as Christians in the place that we live, actually have rather a lot in common with the people of God who were taken into exile. The basic idea being that here in the US and really in the Western world as a whole, we've entered something new, a post-Christian society. And what we mean by that is not that there aren't any Christians left anywhere, clearly, there's some of us even gathered here today, but rather that the status of the Christian faith in culture and society has changed. It's moved from the center rather out to the margins. And that came home for me again, and it does in multiple ways, but again recently when I attended kind of a big birthday party for a person at Trinity. And Shell and I got talking to one of this person's friends who they knew from their local area in Westchester County, someone who they knew from their kids' school. We talked about all kinds of things. This person just moved from the city a few years ago. What was it like coming out to the suburbs, talking about their kids, and all kinds of different things. And she's a lovely young lady and was, very interested in us. And of course, at some point asked, "Well, how do you know the birthday person?" And I answered just very plainly, "Well, I'm a pastor at their church." And she sort of stepped back and was a little stunned for a moment and eventually regained her composure, but still the words didn't quite come out of her mouth. She said, but you're young and wearing normal clothes and drinking a margarita. What? It's almost like she couldn't conceptualize the idea that the job vocation of pastor was actually something that people still did today, right? It's this idea that following Jesus in the region that we live is neither normative or commonplace in our world. And it actually has far more tricky implications than just funny conversations at birthday parties. That's what this idea of life in Babylon, what is it like to live and thrive in exile, is really all about. So, a quick reminder of the story so far. We've been in the book of Daniel, and in it, Nebuchadnezzar is the king of Babylon, which is the most powerful and mighty kingdom in the ancient Near East at the time. And Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar has crushed Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar is this powerful megalomaniac of a ruler. He destroys Jerusalem and then takes all of Jerusalem's best stuff and all of Jerusalem's best people and brings it back to Babylon. And so we encounter in the book of Daniel and his 3 friends who, as teenagers, have been taken from their homes and they've been placed into this Babylonian cultural immersion program. And the idea of this immersion program is to squish and crush all of the Jewishness out of these young men and to make them Babylonians, to assimilate them into Babylonian culture and eventually to give them sort of government jobs in the nation of Babylon. But throughout the book of Daniel, there's a tension. And that's why we're reading the book today. It's why I think it's even in the Bible, and it's why we're preaching about it. The tension throughout the book of Daniel is this. It's that Daniel and his friends didn't actually become Babylonian. In a sense, the immersion program didn't totally work, and that's a good thing. They did in one sense, but they also didn't. They remained very, very faithful to their God. Because although they were Babylonian in the sense that they worked for the Babylonian government and dressed and talked Babylonian, they succeeded even in that place. They were still incredibly faithful to Yahweh. And so what the book of Daniel has taught followers of Jesus now for centuries, and we pray will teach us, is this answer to a question: how do we live in a culture that has a competing vision of life, a competing vision of the future and of joy and hope, and yet still remain faithful to God and his ways, of his vision of what it means to be a human being, of flourishing and of freedom? How do we actually do that? How do we live in a culture like Westchester and Fairfield counties that has this very different vision of life than the vision that Jesus sets before us in and through his life? How do we actually do that? Now, Daniel chapter 3 really hones in on a specific piece of this, which is to do with the idea of allegiance. And that's what we're going to mostly think about this morning. Now, allegiance isn't a term that we use especially commonly, right? We have the Pledge of Allegiance, but that's probably about one of the very few places that we use it in common language. There aren't too many things or people or causes that are at least explicitly running after our allegiance today. I'm aware, though, that that isn't the case everywhere in the world, that actually all around the world today there are people and governments and tribes and organizations and religions that are seeking to enforce allegiance to their way, their values, and their cause very specifically. Although for us here in the US, it probably feels kind of different. Right? No one's knocking on our doors, hopefully, demanding religious allegiance from us through threats of violence or economic pressure or whatever else the thing might be. And yet, if we take a closer look at our lives, it doesn't take too long for us to realize that actually there are a whole host of pressures and a whole host of forces that are acting on us time and again, much more subtly, but nonetheless demanding our allegiance too. And we can identify, I think, what some of those things are. We can do that by asking ourselves a question: well, what truly are the things that I love the most? What are the things that I depend on? What can I not live without? Maybe for some of us, subtly or unknowingly, our allegiance has actually been offered to something like the vision of the good life offered to us by Fairfield and Westchester counties. Right? You know what I'm talking about? The large house, 2.4 children, the Jeep Wrangler that never goes off-road, right? You get the whole picture. Sorry if you're a Wrangler driver. Right? But maybe that's become something that our allegiance has actually gone to. Or maybe for others, it's the opinions of our friends and our peers and our social setting or our colleagues. Do I conform or not to their assumptions and their norms? Maybe my allegiance has even subtly gone to that. For others still, maybe it's the New York City work ethic, hustling, getting identity from working long and hard and being vocationally successful. Maybe it's a political position or a political party. Maybe for others still, it's actually a narrative that you've been given your whole life from your family of origin, or a narrative around your brokenness in some way. Those things have actually, in different cases, demanded allegiance from us. They've become an object of our worship. Very often, I think we place allegiance in the thing that helps us the most, or we think helps us the most. And it's challenging because if we actually take a good, hard look, we might discover that our allegiance isn't to the thing we think it is. Now, this whole idea of allegiance and the tension in that for Christians really isn't a new one. Way back, even as early as the 2nd century, we find a whole host of writings defending the Christian faith to its opponents, and one of those is the Epistle to Dionysius. And in it, the writer talks about this idea of Christian allegiance and how it's different from the surrounding nations that he observes. He says this: Christians are not distinguished from the rest of humanity by country or speech or dress. They live in countries of their own, but simply as sojourners. They share the life of citizens, yet they endure the lot of foreigners. Every foreign land is to them a homeland, and every homeland a foreign land. And here's his point. They spend their existence upon the earth, but their citizenship is in heaven. What the writer's saying is, for the follower of Jesus, for the Christian, what sets someone apart isn't their passport or their language or their dress or their food, but it's their relationship to the world around them, which creates this very real tension. Because yes, on the one hand, we're all citizens of particular nations, the US or wherever you come from. And at the same time, we're all sojourners in our place. The environment or country or place actually aren't the most significant or defining things about us. It means that our ultimate allegiance, our ultimate loyalty, our ultimate trust is not in a country or a culture or even a family, but rather to Jesus and the kingdom of God. And that can be such a real tension for us today, just as it was for the friends of Daniel in chapter 3. So the story in Daniel chapter 3, what's going on? If you're not familiar, Nebuchadnezzar is seeking to reinforce and stabilize his empire, which has gotten quite large at this point. And to do that, he sets up a 90-foot-high golden statue and demands in a festival setting that the statue be worshipped. Verses 4 through 6. The herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O nations and languages," meaning everyone, every single person, "that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, and bagpipe," ideas for the band next week, maybe, every kind of music, you fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the burning fiery furnace, just in case you weren't sure if this was something you wanted to do. Now, this statue, it wasn't a Babylonian deity, it wasn't a god per se, but rather it was sort of this embodiment of the spirit of Babylon. It was this sign and symbol of national unity, national security, and national pride. When all of those various instruments began to play, people were to bow down, in other words, give their allegiance to the cultural identity and civic religion, meaning politics and religion were one, of the nation of Babylon. Now, what's important to know is that Babylon was actually a very pluralistic society. They had gathered people from all kinds of nations and languages and places. And so there were all kinds of different backgrounds and different views and many, many different gods. It was sort of a do whatever you're into kind of a place, right? If it existed in 2019, we might call it a really tolerant place. That's important to understand. Because what Nebuchadnezzar isn't saying is you cannot worship your own gods and you must worship mine. What he's actually saying is more like syncretism. He's saying, I'm asking that you worship the Babylonian gods in addition to whoever else you choose to worship. Sure, you can worship your God, that's not illegal, but in public, bow down and worship the state official gods of Babylon too. That's what a pluralistic culture does. It pressures people into a privatized faith so that in public we look exactly the same as everyone else and no one can tell the difference. We, like in Babylon, live in a time where everything is tolerated except the idea that there's only one way. Maybe you've come across that even in conversations with friends or colleagues or in culture. And that's really the sticking point of Daniel chapter 3, because as the story goes on, there's of course this issue. It's unclear whether exactly everyone was in attendance at this festival, but what's absolutely clear is that not everyone is bowing down. And so the tattletales of the Old Testament world kind of call out Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they say, wait, even though these guys have high positions in the government, they're not bowing down. Do you know this, O king? And they're brought before him. And we heard what he said. He said, is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image I have set up? And actually, in this moment, Nebuchadnezzar comes across as rather reasonable because he's about to give them an out if they want it. He says, now if you're ready, when you hear the sound of all the instruments, to fall down and worship the image I have made, well and good. In other words, he says, I'm willing to consider the possibility that your non-bowing down was just some sort of administrative oversight, but now you're ready. But he says, if you do not worship, we know you shall immediately be cast into the fiery furnace. And who, he says, is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? And their response, stunningly to that, is a very polite, but nonetheless, no thank you. They say no. They refuse. It's this bold, courageous move. I mean, they're talking to a guy who just set up a 90-foot-high golden statue, is obsessed with all kinds of weird instruments, and is threatening to throw them into a furnace. Nebuchadnezzar has a lot of issues. They are definitely going to die. It begs the question, why, or perhaps even how in the world could they possibly make this stand? There's no question that by saying that nonetheless polite no thanks, they are just inviting a world of very real, very physical pain into their lives. But yet there was something in them that was somehow ready for this moment. Whenever I read Daniel chapter 3, I'm reminded of my good friend Vinny Munyosi, who's one of the pastors at Jenga in Uganda, one of our Trinity Serves partners. A few of us were just there in June with him. And when we were there in June, Rob is actually cut out of this picture. He's on the other side. But you can ask Rob about Vinny later. But when we were there, Vinny reminded us of his story of coming to faith in Jesus for the first time. And it's a really sobering story. Vinny, as a teenager, had been beaten to within an inch of his life by the man he believed at the time to be his father, and was in a coma in the hospital. And when he, many days later, kind of came to from the coma, he found actually none of his family members there caring for him or providing food or doing the customary thing, which is to be in the hospital with the person. But instead found himself surrounded by a group of women from one of the local churches who were praying for him, who were providing his food, who were giving him what he needed and really helping him be restored to full health. And it took many months for him to kind of come through that ordeal. But through it, he came to faith in Jesus. He said, I was born again. There was this whole new life in me. There was a huge change for him through that experience. And so months later, when he was fully recovered, he too made this bold and courageous move. He went back to his home, which was a little way up the mountain next to the town where the hospital was. And he went to his father, and his father, not unlike Nebuchadnezzar, kind of had this syncretistic thing going on where he was kind of Muslim, kind of worshipped the ancestors, kind of into the tribal religions, and it was all kind of smushed together. And he went to his father and he said, this is what's happened to me. I've come to faith in Jesus. I'm a new person now. Things are different for me. And his father did exactly what Vinny predicted. He said, you have one day, and you can leave this place forever, or you can die at my hands. And so Vinny did the bold thing. He left everything he'd known. He left his family, his home, any sense of security, and just left that place never to return. In fact, he ended up living in a leper colony for many weeks because that was the only place he could afford to live before missionaries eventually took him in. It's a sobering story. What in the world, though, would propel someone like Vinny, or someone like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to make those kind of bold and courageous moves. It could really only be, in both cases and many others, even happening all around our world today, that there's a deeper allegiance, a deeper commitment that had been made that superseded the circumstances on the outside. A commitment not to what's expedient or easy, but to the deepest truth inside of a person. I'm guessing here, but my guess is that for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego back in Daniel chapter 3, it had something to do with this commitment they had declared and recited again and again and again back in Jerusalem. This sort of primal confession and cry of the Jewish people in the Shema, which we read in Deuteronomy 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength. That was the heartbeat. That was the most fundamental and basic claim of their faith. It was saying there's one God, and this one God has the entire claim, the total claim over every part of life, both personally and communally. That their God, Yahweh, was the one who ruled over every single aspect of life. And so when the Jewish people would declare the Shema again and again, they were saying their ultimate allegiance was to the one true God. They were saying no to the veritable buffet of gods in the ancient Near East, the gods of the river and the rain and the harvest, the sun and fertility and the temple and all of the things. They were saying no to that. They were saying no to the religious pluralism of Babylon and saying, no, actually the one God, Yahweh, has the ultimate and only and supreme claim over my life. They've said it again and again and again. Even so, in that moment in front of Nebuchadnezzar, now they're faced with a death sentence and they have to figure out what to do. I don't know about you, but if it was me, maybe as I approached the furnace and felt its glow and warmth, I might have reconsidered. I might have thought, well, someone spent a long time making that statue. It's quite shiny and beautiful. Maybe just, go take a little peek. After all, they spent so long, it's only polite to at least check it out, right? And it's so beautiful. I mean, maybe a little bowing's appropriate, maybe. Maybe you would have reconsidered. But here's what they actually say. They say, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. And then these three crazy words, but if not. Even if it doesn't happen, they say, be it known to you, O king, we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image you have set up. They're able to say those words, even if not, but if not, because they know that their ultimate allegiance isn't to a king in this world. It's not to an economic system. It's not to a country. It's not to anything that can ultimately be hidden or taken from them. Because their trust is in the center of their world, the one true God of all things. And so in this moment, they find themselves to be almost fearless and invincible. And of course, we know the consequences, right? Nebuchadnezzar goes absolutely berserk. He orders for them to be bound and thrown into the fire. He says, heat it to 7 times the normal heat, which is a literary way of saying as hot as it can possibly be. It's so hot that even the soldiers who are throwing them in are burned up and killed. And yet, even still, that's not the end of the story. Verse 24, Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, didn't we cast 3 men into the fire? And he goes on, I see 4 men unbound, walking around in the midst of the fire. They're not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. He's saying, wait, this is impossible. How are they still alive? And what in the world are 4 people doing in there? There's a whole bunch of debate about who that 4th figure is. Maybe it's an angel. Maybe it's the pre-incarnate Jesus. Maybe it's some other manifestation of the presence of God. Really, the precise answer to that question doesn't really matter, because the point is that God himself was delivering them. God himself was with them in the fire. God himself was protecting them and making his power and his glory and his sovereignty known. They entered the fire not knowing what the result would be, but they trusted in who God had said he was and who he had made them to be. Now, when we think about those events of Daniel chapter 3, right, being asked to bow down to a statue, being forced to worship a foreign god, it's so easy for us to think of it as something other, right? Something far away, something long ago, something in a context completely different than our own. And maybe it can leave us thinking, well, that's a nice, encouraging story, but so what? We think we would never worship an ancient god. How primitive. We would never bow down to a golden statue. We wouldn't worship, for instance, Bacchus, the god of wine. We wouldn't worship Molech, one of the gods who demanded child sacrifices, literally throwing children into the fire. We would never do that. We think that. But at times, some of us drink too much. At times, some of us treat ours or other people's children less than is right and good and everything God would have for them for a whole variety of reasons. And suddenly, Bacchus and Moloch actually don't seem quite so far away. Because when we actually stop and reflect on the things that we do, even very normal things in everyday life, if we actually examined it, I think what we might find is that some of the things we do look very much like just a modern 21st century version of the very same things that ancient people did to serve their gods. We so often do the very same things because the truth is there will always, 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 always be a test of our allegiance. We may not even realize it, but I wonder if this morning some of us have become intoxicated or even indoctrinated, formed in a particular way of life that has actually become an object of worship for us. Whether it's secularism or progress, or money or wealth or materialism, or sexual freedom or radical autonomy or the pursuit of individual happiness, whatever it is. This vision of what life is supposed to look like that we've sort of set up for ourselves, that we've taken it in, we've drunk it in, and it's actually become something we've begun to worship through our lives. And what's hard about that is when we actually look at our lives, when we look at the results, I think so many testimonies of ours and other people's would be, it just doesn't feel like that's actually working for us. That all of those other allegiances, whether it's a vision of the good life in this area, or the New York City work ethic, or the opinions of our peers and friends, or our family of origin story, whatever it might be, all of those other things that we've subconsciously given allegiance and worship to have actually failed spectacularly to deliver on the things they promised. They've become gods in our lives. They've demanded worship. They've demanded sacrifice. They've actually stolen and robbed from us and ultimately left us emptier than when we started. Maybe you resonate with that experience. And we think we need a better way. It's easy to read a story like Daniel chapter 3 and see it as sort of a moralistic tale to be better, be brave, stand up for what you believe. And that's good. There's actually truth in that. But we also all know our absolute incapability of doing